So for our writers, what was your initial response to the feedback you received?
I was overwhelmed with Kenna's, and then I read Stacy's, and it made me feel a little better. And I felt a little misunderstood with Kenna, especially with Kenna's focus on the rational idea, which really was interesting to me, because for me, thought I was pushing that boundary, my whole stuff about the tree and hugging the tree, that's not rational. And so then I thought I was communicating the opposite of what Kenna picked up. So that was disappointing to me as a writer, like, oh, she didn't get what I was hoping.
I thought that was kind of the pinnacle of the story when you decided to hug that tree, and that's why I wanted you to change the title.
Yes, I remember that. Yes, I didn't change the title. I did revise it, but I did not change the title.
So what did you do ultimately with the feedback you got from Kenna?
Well, I wrestled with it, and I ignored it for a while. But then because we were doing this, it pushed me to say, no, I'm going to jump in there and take a look at it. And then some of the stuff I didn't, so I didn't change the title. I didn't give a lot more contextual information about the sources I used. I gave a little bit more. So in some, I kind of pushed back. But then in others, like the sentence level stuff, which really surprised me, because at first I just thought, no, that was off. That was not helpful. But then I decided, Kenna's comment about having shorter, kind of snappier sentences in certain parts to kind of reiterate or kind of be a parallel to what I was talking about would be helpful. And she kind of convinced me eventually of that.
So for me, with Ron's comments, one of the first things that I had to do was figure out how to take the scarcity of the comments. What did that mean? And I often find that when there aren't very many comments on a story, I like that. I interpret that as saying there's a decent chance this reader was absorbed. There wasn't anything significant kicking them out of the experience, and so that's how I chose to interpret most of that. And I did use some of his comments to revise, most specifically those where he was talking about things that felt perhaps cliche to him, because I know that he has read a lot in the genre, not stuff that's exactly like mine, but that's similar enough that if he's seeing things as being familiar, they're probably familiar to a number of my intended readers as well. So with those, I just said, okay, what am I doing here? What am I trying to achieve? Is there a way I can do this that would be less recognizable within the genre? And so I made some changes with that. For Jamie's comments, the summative comment at the end where she was basically saying, I was always aware of this as a reader. I never identified to the point where I kind of lost focus that I was reading. And that was an interesting comment, and it's honestly one that I'm still kind of kicking about, trying to figure out what I'm going to do with it, if anything. Because this is a story I've already repurposed once, right? And it was originally intended to be a fable. And so it's as much about that genre, it's as much about that form as it is the story itself. And so to some degree,
that was really clear to me.
Yeah, and so normally when I write a story, I want the reader to identify, to lose sense of the fact that they're reading. But when you're doing a piece of metafiction where you're actually commenting on the genre itself, is it reasonable to assume that a reader would be able to get that level of identification, even though I'm trying to say something about the genre? And I don't know the answer to that question. I don't know how much of this response is the product of Jamie being a trained critic in literature. I don't know how much of it is that she's an English teacher. I don't know how much of it is that she has acknowledged she felt somewhat anxious about being able to give the feedback, and how much of it was genuinely a product of what I was trying to do and perhaps competing objectives. And that's still something I don't know that I've figured out. So I'm considering doing another repurposing of the story. But if I decided to do that, I would have to figure out how do I bridge that distance, and if I do, will that fable-like quality be lost? And so I still haven't decided what I'm going to do with that feedback.
Well, it's a complex piece. I mean, so I was always aware of saying, whoa, this foreshadowing is really working really well. These elements are pretty cool. Clearly Clint knows about this, you know, about these. I mean, I was aware of what you knew and what you were doing on the one hand, but I didn't know that you were setting it up as a piece of metafiction in that sense. So that perhaps explains why I was focusing on how it was written, what elements you were using, and what kind of an impact it made on me because of that. So I was always aware of the writing itself and not the story that was written.
Which I think I could consider a type of success.
Yeah.
But there's always that latent tendency as a storyteller to always want someone to kind of to kind of have the reader and have them not recognize that they're being carried along. And so your comments help me to think about, am I trying to achieve two different objectives there that are perhaps mutually exclusive?
Fighting against each other, that's possible.
Well,
So-
in a similar vein, I reread the story this morning and thinking about this meeting, and I actually enjoyed it quite a bit more the second time, because I think I started to maybe better pick up on the kind of meta moves you're making, or I connected better overall with the piece. I remember in this reading when I hit that line when you said too deep to tempt the hag, and I'd noticed that same line in my first reading, but that's the kind of your reveal about your character, and I was like, like I liked it. So that made me wonder about the role of, you know, like the first reading versus the second reading. And then also, by then I'd heard you talk about the story more too, so then, you know, I don't know what that ultimately says. But